Today, my guest is Father Donald Haggerty. Father Haggerty is a priest in the Archdiocese of New York. He serves at St. Patrick's Cathedral. He's the author of 5 books. His books include Contemplative Provocations, The Contemplative Hunger, Conversion, and Contemplative Enigmas. Today, we're going to be discussing his new book, St. John of the Cross, Master of Contemplation. Father Haggerty, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're welcome. It's great to have you, Father.
Thanks.
First question I have is, who is St. John of the Cross?
Well, St. John of the Cross is he's called the mystical doctor of the church, but his background, he's from the 1500s. He was a contemporary and indeed a friend of St. Teresa of Avila, who had begun the Carmelite reform in that mid 1500s. It's also the century of St. Ignatius of Loyola and the century of the Protestant Reformation. And St. John of the Cross was about 25 years younger than St. Teresa of Avila. When he was ordained, a few weeks after that, he met St. Teresa of Avila, who had already had about 5 years into her reform of the cloistered Carmelite sisters. And she invited him to join in this reform of also the men's branch of the Carmelites. And that was the beginning of his association with her, but also it's an important event in his own life because it's from his writings and his experience with the reform and the Carmelite sisters that we have the treatises that he wrote in time. And he is a major figure in spiritualities. And sometimes, for some people, he frightens or he intimidates or he's thought to be too high. But a rebuttal to that would be St. Teresa of Lisieux, whom most people love and know. She said that between the ages of 19 and 21, she read him continually in the Carmel. And she said that after that 2-year period reading him, she could find no other spiritual writing that matched that. And that had a great influence on her own life then. So he is the premier teacher on prayer in the church, but also on deeper spirituality. And so I encourage any of your listeners, yes, to this book that's been written about him, which can be a nice, opening to him, but also to read passages from him. His aphorisms are very great. They're very readable and useful.
Why are his writings so important, Father?
Well, I think that John of the Cross was gifted by God not only to, write as a mystic. Something he doesn't write really as a mystic. He writes as a teacher, an instructor on what really leads to the path of a great union with God. Mm-hmm. And he doesn't just teach prayer as a method and, the entrance into greater interior life with God. He has much experience with other souls, having been a spiritual director, a confessor to many Carmelites and his own friars. And so he's a great teacher. It's good to know Pope John Paul II, now St. John Paul II, wrote his doctoral dissertation on John Paul as a young priest in Rome under the guidance of the famous Dominican Father Garrigou Lagrange. And he too was very much affected by the teaching of St. John of the Cross on prayer. So I think he's when you read certain passages of him and read them again and again over a number of years, it's like reading the gospel in one way, that we find that there's greater depth, greater insight gained from reading him with some repetition over time.
I found personally St. John of the Cross, when I first picked it up, it was very hard for me to read. It was challenging. And then I started taking some courses in spiritual direction and started reading St. John of the Cross again and found the writings to be truly beautiful. Mm. And I had a hard time putting them down at that point in time. How do you recommend that somebody gets started reading St. John of the Cross, besides starting with your book to help?
Well, as I mentioned in the book, I suggest reading his poetry. He's
Mhm.
one of the great Spanish poets, and the translations are also very beautiful. Um, some of your listeners may be aware that, as part of this reform in the Carmelites, he had lived a more or less quiet life for about 5 or 6 years as a chaplain for the Carmelite sisters at the Incarnation Carmel in Avila. And then he was kidnapped by the Carmelite order, the men's branch, because at that point they resented some of the effort to reform and put the order at a more rigorous level of living. And he was imprisoned in what was a converted closet for 9 months. And during that time, he composed his very great and famous poem, a 40 stanza poem, the Spiritual Canticle. And to me, that's a good place to start with John of the Cross, to read these poems. And then what he does with the poems is he uses them then as points of departure for commentary on spiritual life. But as an example, the first stanza poem of the spiritual canticle reads, where have you hidden, beloved, and left me moaning? You fled like a stag after wounding me. I went out seeking you, and you were gone. And he will use that kind of verse then to talk about the hiddenness of God, the soul seeking him and longing, for a lifetime. So he's a poet. It's also good to read his aphorisms, which would be in the collected works. At the end of my book, I include some of as an example, a few pages of these aphorisms. And they're also great. They were written as little messages of sorts to individual Carmelites who kept them, and then they were collected after his death. And in the collected works, they're about 20 to 25 pages. So those are good places to start, surely, with him.
And you can actually buy the collected works.
That's right. That's a single volume. And what I found, though, in reading him for actually many years, over 35 years, is that he's difficult to read if you just go he has 4 major treatises. So the Ascent of Mount Carmel, the Dark Night, the Spiritual Canticle, the Living Flame of Love. And he's not a writer where you just read through those 4 treatises chronologically and gain, the fullness of his teaching. I think he's much better to be read. He's not writing in an orderly manner in that. So the effort of this book was to take these subjects, these topical issues that are, crucial in spiritual life, and target and zero in on the subject, because sometimes he's talking about the same thing in 3 different works. So to bring the subjects into a synthetic manner of focus. So I think we probably shouldn't talk about our own book in this manner, but I wanted to write a book that would make John of the Cross attractive and more accessible to readers and make him really useful for people in their spiritual life. And I hope that was accomplished here.
I've read from the book so far, Father, I would say you did a great job of doing that.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that.
Oh, you're welcome. And I highly recommend purchasing the book to learn more about St. John of the Cross. Father, in your previous books, I've read them all, and I feel like you've been taking your readers into a deeper level of prayer progressively with each book. Would you like to comment on that?
Well, that's true, Jeff. I think, I look at those 3 books with contemplative titles as doing that. The first, all of those books, by the way, are very much influenced by St. John of the Cross. And he has been someone I have read, as I mentioned, all through these years, not every day, but always going back to him. And that first book is a effort to really see the importance of the hiddenness of God, how that provokes the longing of the soul in spiritual life, and the various ways we are provoked to a greater encounter with God. The second book, The Contemplative Hunger, is getting into it a little bit more deeply. What happens really in contemplative prayer, the hunger of the soul, the suffering even of the interior life in seeking God. And then that third volume, the contemplative enigmas, some of the, the puzzling difficulties in darkness that any soul will experience as we advance in a persevering life of prayer with God. So, and those books, if people like the St. John of the Cross book, they may find, if they haven't looked at those other books, that they will resonate much more after that, because St. John of the Cross is filling those pages also, those three books.
So what led you to the point where you decided to write a book on St. John of the Cross and his works?
Well, the pandemic helped that. Because we had the lockdown in New York, and so then at that point, I always loved St. John of the Cross, and the thought came to me, you have some time now with New York locked down, and so I began to write, and I began to write at night with extra time, and then I intended to do what I could do with this. And I've read him so much that I have a lot of passages underlined, and sometimes in red ink and more black ink. And so I went to the leading key passages that I have found in St. John of the Cross over the years, and especially on the question of contemplation in prayer and the preliminaries that are required for that. And so, I have to thank the pandemic for that. That gave some time for it. And then once I got started, I wanted to complete it.
Well, I know you've read St. John of the Cross for 30 some years. Is there anything that you learned while you were writing this book?
Well, some passages of John of the Cross, this happened to me many times over years. They shine out, a little more strongly at times. And I would say there was an example of that in reading again, ends up in the book, when John of the Cross will talk about not just the wounds of love that the soul experiences, but he has a passage in the commentary on stanza 35 of the Spiritual Canticle, when he speaks about God wounded in love for the soul, when he sees a person wounded in love for him. And that struck me very much this time around. God wounded in love for the one, that loves him in a greater manner. So I would say also just reading sometimes him and writing about it, added to the impact of St. John of the Cross upon myself. And when he's a great teacher on love. He has a passage in one of his aphorisms: in the evening of life, you will be examined in love. It all comes down to love in our life. And, he says, then abandon your own ways of acting and, give to God what he wants. So I think when you keep reading him, I know no other writer where you, at least for me, and I think it's true for others, that you can read passages of John of the Cross again and again and not tire, because there's depth to them that's beyond an experience of that point in our lives. But you sense there is greater depth here, and there's a need to keep in pursuit of God.
Father, what was your goal in writing the book?
I mean, I would say my most pragmatic goal was to make St. John of the Cross attractive and accessible, to people. I've done, I think, as you know, I've done many retreats with the Missionaries of Charity over the years, and I've heard a number of times people feel a bit intimidated or consider John of the Cross, beyond their life. And I think he's essential for people who are serious about prayer. And if you're going to live some, commitment in a daily way to interior prayer, some silent time before God, he's an essential, indispensable writer. So, and I do think that he's difficult if we, as I mentioned, try to go through these treatises, one after another. And over the years, I have done that, but I wanted to bring this down to a manageable, useful way. And it's not so easy, even with this book, but to me, at least it gives some more, a clarity and brings these passages, to a prominence, which can certainly have a great effect on a reader, I think.
Absolutely. Father, what else would you like to share with the regular Catholic guys out there?
Well, the primary thing, if I had a chance to speak to people, and I say this in my own confessions at St. Patrick's Cathedral to people, I say it from the pulpit, I say it to your listeners, the most important thing we're doing in life is prayer. And that we can't give our whole life to time of prayer, but it's so important that we root ourselves in some committed time of prayer. And many people say they don't really have the time for it. But if we look at the manner of which we're doing many other things in a day and other distracting elements of our life, if we can carve out, let's say 20 minutes minimum, but a half hour or longer in prayer, if we can do it in front of a tabernacle or monstrance, since many churches do have Eucharistic adoration, that silent time in prayer is really literally under the gaze of God. And without our realizing it, it has impact then on the soul. We begin to be drawn, like a fragrance draws us. We begin to be drawn more into the taste of God himself. So prayer is the great recommendation, certainly for everyone, as best as we can do it.
Oh, Father, there's a lot of men that I've talked to, and when I tell them about 30 minutes of prayer, it sounds like hours of prayer for them. How do you recommend that somebody gets started in that prayer time? Because it is so important.
Well, I mean, I think it's good to do, try the best you can. If it's 5 minutes, it's 5 minutes, but 5 minutes is 5 minutes. It's not that long. And sometimes it's good to pause sometimes in a day, if possible. That's great, actually. If we can pause for a minute, try to recollect, being in the presence of God, maybe carrying a rosary in one's pocket so that, even just gripping the crucifix for a moment, but putting ourselves in the presence of God frequently, if possible. Most people are traveling. We could pray a rosary when we travel, a finger rosary or praying a rosary in the car. I always do that myself. Those things are possible. But I think it's like it's almost like physical exercise. Some people would say, there's no way I can, run for a half hour. That might be true the first day. But most people, when they begin exercising, find, okay, the 5 minutes can lead to the 10 minutes, now 20 minutes. Now I'm very comfortable with a half hour, 40 minutes. So it's a similar kind of approach. If we choose, we sometimes quickly cross thresholds there that are, more. And I think when we're beginning prayer, it's good to, use the Gospels, to read through the Gospel, which is it's so beautiful, really, to read the Gospels, hear the words of our Lord privately, also day in and day out, and sense that he's speaking to us personally.
Well, you talk about having a rosary in your pocket. I remember many years ago, I started carrying a rosary in my pocket, and it helped me during the day because I would just put my fingers on the crucifix and it just kept me kind of centered during the whole day.
Yeah, that's great.
I found myself habitually doing that. So I do recommend that one for all the guys out there. That's a really good practice. Besides that, it'll force you to take it out sometimes and say it, hopefully on a daily basis.
No, that's great. I think traveling is certainly an opportunity to pray also. I mean, I ride the subways in New York, quite a bit. Most people have that cell phone, that's in their hand or, close by, and it's, kind of a constant distraction. But occasionally you see somebody I carry the finger rosary in the walking in the streets or, on the subway, and it's not, to be holy. It's better to me than wandering around in my mind and being just losing time.
Right.
So,
and it's a great way to get that 30 minutes of prayer.
it helps also. I mean, it adds to prayer.
Absolutely.
I mean, I'm one of the privileges of being a priest. I can pray before the tabernacle. It's the great privilege, really, of a priest or religious. So I can get my hours in there, but also in the day, it's nice to have those extra, opportunities for prayer.
Father, where's the best place to purchase the book?
Well, it's selling with it's published by Ignatius Press. It can be ordered directly from them. Amazon also has this available, also in Kindle. It's available on Amazon, and hopefully Catholic bookstores. Certainly, they would order it in any local Catholic bookstore if needed.
We've been talking about St. John of the Cross and Father's new book, St. John of the Cross, Master of Contemplation. I highly recommend the book. It's a great place to get started with St. John of the Cross. Father, thank you for being on the show, and God bless.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for having me. God bless you.
Oh, you're welcome.